3. Father Anthony Kosturos. Let us return now to the views on evolution of other Orthodox Christians. In another article of the Greek Archdiocese's Orthodox Observer, February 6, 1974, Father Anthony Kosturos answers a question sent in by a reader. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, where did their son Cain get his wife? Does our church shed any light on this question? Father Kosturos replies, man's origin is too far back in history for any person or group to know how man began. What then is the book of Genesis for? Science is still groping for answers. The word Adam denotes earth, the word Eve, life. Generally, and only generally, our traditional theologians take the view that all of us stem from one male and one female. There are others who feel that humankind appeared in clusters, a few here and a few there. No theologian has the definitive answer on the subject of man's origin and his development. The dawn of human history is a mystery. According to Father Kosturos, it is science that is trying to find the answer to this question. Evidently, the Orthodox interpretation of Genesis is quite symbolical and allegorical. We do not really know whether such a person as Adam ever existed. This is the view presented by the official Greek Archdiocese newspaper. And what of the Orthodox theology of Adam and the first created man? What of the Orthodox feast devoted to Adam and the other forefathers? What of those who have Adam for their patron saint? Is it a matter of indifference to an Orthodox Christian that the Church, if the Christian evolutionists are correct, may have been mistaken all these centuries in her teaching on this subject, and that this teaching may now have to be revised if science, after all, does come up with the answer to the question of man's origin? Is it an exaggeration to say that it is extremely important for an Orthodox Christian to have a very clear view of the Church's teaching on the origin of man, as well as a clear understanding of the limits of science in exploring this question? Later, in another answer to a reader's question, Father Kosturos says, perhaps there are many Adams and Eves who appeared concurrently in different areas and then met. How man was created and how man procreated initially is a mystery. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Our Church gives you the opportunity to ponder the subjects you mention and come up with your own speculation about them. The answer to the question, where did Cain get his wife, is actually very easy. Adam and Eve had many children who are not mentioned by name in Genesis. The account of Genesis is only the basic outline of the story. 4. Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner, 1904-1984, is widely considered to be the leading Roman Catholic theologian of the 20th century. He served as an official papal theological expert before and during the Second Vatican Council. Father Kosturos mentions the possibility that humankind appeared in clusters. This is a reference to the evolutionary theory of polygenism. The prominent Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who until recently was rather conservative in his views on evolution, has examined this question and has made a reconciliation of the evolutionary view with the Christian doctrine in a way that will doubtless be imitated by the Greek Archdiocese in the future. In general, the Orthodox modernists are always one step behind the Roman Catholics in this process of updating the Church's views. In an article entitled Original Sin, Polygenism and Freedom, Summarized in Theology Digest, Spring 1973, Rahner posed two questions. 1. How is evolution compatible with the doctrine of Adam's preternatural gifts? 2. Can we seriously think that the first man to evolve was capable of the first sin? He answers, scientists prefer to conceive hominization, that is, the making of man, as having taken place in many individuals, a population, rather than in a single pair. Actually, some scientists think that and some don't. He says that it is the first group of recognizable men, or original men, that committed the first transgression. Grace could be offered to the original group and, upon being rejected by that group's free and yet mutually influencing choice, be lost to the whole of succeeding humanity. Rahner then asks, in the first man or group such as paleontology reveals to us, how could there have been a degree of freedom sufficiently developed to have made possible such a fateful choice as original sin? How can we attempt to reconcile the supernatural or preternatural paradise situation of Adam, or individual or group, with what we know of the origins of the biological, anthropological, cultural world? He answers his question by saying, it is not easy to determine precisely where and when an earthly creature actually became spirit and thus free. We may serenely reckon with the fact that original sin really happened, but at a moment which cannot be more accurately determined. It was sometime within a fairly long time span during which many individuals may have been already existing and capable of performing the guilty act simultaneously. In other words, the whole thing becomes very vague. Obviously, the next generation of thinkers is going to do away with some of this double talk. 5. Stephanus Trooster. A recent book by another Jesuit sums up well the attitude of the enlightened Christian toward Adam and paradise. Stephanus Trooster is a Dutch Jesuit who, in his book Evolution and the Doctrine of Original Sin, states forthrightly, those who take the scientific doctrine of evolution seriously can no longer accept the traditional presentation. So we must find an interpretation that is relevant to our times. The proponents of the doctrine of evolution, he says, visualize mankind as a reality which in the course of history only very gradually matured to achieve a degree of self-realization. Its earliest emergence must be conceived of as fumbling transitional forms appearing next to extremely primitive levels of human existence. Such primitive intermediate forms of human life still must have been intimately fused with their prehistoric animal state. But in this evolutionary theory there is no room for a paradisiacal existence of this prehistoric man. To place an extremely gifted and highly privileged spiritual man at the beginning of human life on earth appears in complete contradiction to modern scientific thought on this matter. This, of course, is true. Trooster continues, acceptance of the modern viewpoint, however, eliminates the possibility of accounting for the genesis of evil in the world on the basis of sin committed by the first man. After all, how could so primitive a human being have been in a position to refuse God's offer of salvation? How could such a primitive being have been capable of a breach of covenant with God? Since for Trooster the fall of man is not a historical event, he explains the existence of evil by giving it a new name, the phenomenon of cosmic immaturity, Adam actually is not one man, he is every man. And the book of Genesis is an idealized image of a world without sin. The author of Genesis knows quite well it does not correspond to reality. He specifically did not mean to say that the original state of grace of Adam and Eve in all its purity was once upon a time an actual reality in the history of mankind. Of course, if you believe in evolution, it makes no sense to talk about paradise. You're only fooling yourself if you try to combine these two different forms of thinking. Theologians like Trooster have drawn thoroughgoing conclusions from the message of evolution. Is it possible to believe in evolution and not draw these conclusions? 6. The Roman Catholic view of original man. The Roman Catholics in the past have had some problems about knowing when man began if one accepts evolution. There are different theories depending on what one thinks. I don't know what is allowed now, but in the old days you were not allowed to believe that man's soul could evolve from matter. You had to believe that man was given a soul at a particular moment. At that moment he became man, and therefore he was no longer subject to all the laws of evolution. Footnote: commenting on Pope John Paul II's recent statement to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, October 22, 1996, that the theory of evolution is more than a hypothesis, Cardinal Thomas J. Vining of Scotland summarized the Roman Catholic Church's position on evolution as follows. The Church leaves the believer free to accept or reject the various evolutionary hypotheses so long as they do not insist that the mind and spirit of man simply emerge from the forces of living matter with no room for God. The Glasgow Herald, January 11, 1997, page 19. Nevertheless, there are many Roman Catholics who remain opposed to evolution, including scientists who have written books and papers against it. Among these are Dr. Guy Berthold, Geology in France, Dr. Roberto Fondi, Paleontology, and Dr. Giuseppe Sermonti, Genetics, in Italy, and Dr. Wolfgang Smith, Physics, Mathematics, in the United States. End of footnote. Obviously, this is sticking in one of these epicycles again to make the theory correspond to one's own beliefs. Either you believe in evolution, in which case man is a very primitive creature which came from the beasts, and the textbooks on evolution will tell you that man still has the savage inside of him, and all the pictures show him evolving from a monkey-like creature, or else you believe that man descended from a being who was greater than we are now, who was actually perfect man in his own way and was not subject to corruption. The Holy Fathers even tell us that Adam did not void fecal matter. He had the tree of life to eat from, but he did not eat as we do now. In his conversation with Motovilov, Saint Seraphim of Sarov has a whole section on the state of Adam, how he was not subject to being injured or hurt. He was quite invulnerable to the elements, he could not be drowned, etc. It is interesting that, even in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas asked precisely these questions and tried to solve them. What was the state of Adam? Did he void fecal matter? How was it that he could not be harmed? He has elaborate explanations. First of all, he says that Adam did void fecal matter because we cannot believe that he would be of a different material than we are now. Secondly, he was never harmed and was impervious to drowning, not because it was impossible, but because God arranged to take all the boulders out of the way, never to have the stream rise too high, etc. In other words, God arranged the world correctly so that Adam walked very carefully and never happened to get hurt. But Orthodoxy believes that our nature was originally immortal. Abba Dorotheus says this in the very first chapter of his Discourses, where he sets forth for us the image of Adam, the first man, to give us an inspiration of what we have to strive for and get back to. We are meant to live eternally in the body, and that is the way it was in the beginning. Only after falling did we lose that nature and that blessed state in which Adam was beholding God. According to Orthodoxy, the immortal state of man in paradise was his nature. Our nature now is changed. Then we were potentially immortal. Now we have been changed into a mortal being that is mortal in the body. The Catholics teach, on the contrary, that the state of man in paradise was a supernatural state, that man actually was just like we know him today, mortal man, but God gave him an extra gift, a special state of grace. When he fell, he simply fell away from that extra grace which had been added to him, and therefore his nature was not changed. But according to Orthodoxy, our very nature was changed and ruined at the fall. Christ is the new Adam, and in him we are restored to our old nature. Some fathers, like Saint Simeon, the new theologian, discussed the question, why then did we not immediately become immortal when Christ died and resurrected? Saint Simeon says it was so that we would not be forced to be saved. We still must achieve our own salvation. And the creation is waiting for us to achieve our salvation when it too will rise up to the state in which it was before the fall. In fact, even to a higher state. All this is filled with mysteries. It's beyond us, but still we know enough of it from the Holy Fathers. Saint Simeon has a long quote on the state of man before the fall. The whole of creation, he says, was incorrupt just like man, and only after the fall did the creatures begin to die. When the new world comes, the new heaven and the new earth, then the meek will inherit the earth. What earth is that? It is this earth you see right here, only it will be burned up and restored so that all the creatures now will be incorruptible. That is what the whole creation is striving for, what the creatures are groaning after. When St. Paul said they were subject to vanity, this means they were subject to corruption through the fall of man. 7. Theodosius Dobzhansky. Let us turn now to an Orthodox Christian evolutionist whose ideas are quite in harmony with recent Roman Catholic thought on the subject of evolution, and who brings up still other implications of the evolutionary theory which any Orthodox Christian must study closely. Theodosius Dobzhansky is a Russian Orthodox scientist who is often quoted by other Christian evolutionists. A well-known geneticist, he is presently professor of genetics at the University of California at Davis. I think he still has his fruit flies and is continuing to make experiments on them to prove evolution. Footnote: Father Seraphim is referring to Dobzhansky's attempt to create a new species by exposing fruit flies to radiation so as to cause mutant offspring. Ian Taylor, in his book In the Minds of Men, 1991, writes about such attempts. Experimentation with fruit flies began in the 1920s with Thomas Hunt Morgan and today is still a minor industry among researchers. The stubborn fruit fly has endured every genetic indignity possible, but so far not one has ever produced anything except another fruit fly. End of footnote. He was born in Russia in the year of the canonization of Saint Theodosius of Chernigov, 1900, in answer to prayer from his parents, and that is why he was called Theodosius. Alas, he became an apostate. He came to America in the 20s and has been an American since that time. Footnote: Henry M. Morris writes, Dobzhansky was probably, next to Julian Huxley, the most influential evolutionist of the 20th century. Dobzhansky reposed in 1975, the same year that Father Seraphim gave the lecture from which this chapter has been taken. End of footnote. He has been absolutely prohibited in Soviet Russia, although the Soviet scientists know about him. Once, when a film was accidentally presented at one scientific meeting in Russia, which showed him on it, all the scientists cheered, but the film was withdrawn. He is considered non-existent, a non-person because he left Russia, but he thinks like a communist. Although he was baptized Orthodox, when his wife died, he had her cremated, took the ashes and scattered them in the Sierras. Cremation is strictly forbidden in the Orthodox Church. As far as one can see, he never goes to church. He is quite beyond religion. Nevertheless, for his Christian evolutionist views, he was granted an honorary doctorate of theology by St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary in New York in 1972. At the same time, he gave an address to the Second International Theological Conference of the Orthodox Theological Society of America, which was attended by all the renowned theologians of the various Orthodox bodies. His ideas on evolution, from what he and many official representatives of Orthodoxy in America apparently believe to be an Orthodox viewpoint, are set forth in two Orthodox periodicals, St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly and Concern. In an article which was well publicized and summarized without comment in many Orthodox periodicals in America, Evolution, God's Special Method of Creation, Concern, Spring 1973, Dobzhansky accuses anyone opposed to the theory of evolution of blasphemy. He says in this article, "Natural selection is a blind and a creative process. Natural selection does not work according to a foreordained plan." Dobzhansky notes the extraordinary variety of life on the earth and calls it whimsical and superfluous. He says, "What a senseless operation to fabricate a multitude of species ex nihilo, from nothing, and then let most of them die out. What is the sense of having as many as 2 or 3 million species living on Earth? Was the Creator in a jocular mood? Is the Creator playing practical jokes?" No, Dobzhansky reasons. The organic diversity becomes, however, reasonable and understandable if the Creator has created the living world not by gratuitous caprice, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. It is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. What he means by this is that it actually makes no difference whether you have a God or not. He says that God makes 2 or 3 million species by means of natural selection. Is that any less silly than saying he created the original kinds all at once? According to Dobzhansky, there is no plan to it. It is all just a blind process. For an Orthodox Christian, this raises the question, does God begin the process of evolution and then have no control over its end? What of God's providence, without which not a hair of our head falls? In this point of Christian evolutionary philosophy, we see how false is the very question which the evolutionist is striving to answer. The creative activity of God is not sufficient explanation for him of the diversity of the visible creation. There must be a better explanation, one based on the clearly un-Christian presupposition that God is not in control of his own creation, that his providence does not exist. Footnote: Dobzhansky wrote, "Man has evolved from ancestors that were not human. The creation of God's image in man is not an event but a process, and therefore the moral law is a product of an evolutionary development." Dobzhansky, Ethics and Values in Biological and Cultural Evolution, Zygon, the Journal of Religion and Science, as reported in the Los Angeles Times, June 16, 1974, Part 4, page 6. End of footnote. The God of this kind of evolutionary philosophy is clearly deistic, and the view of this Christian evolutionist is not to be distinguished from that of the semi-Christian or non-Christian Lecomte du Noyer. Dobzhansky is filled with the usual liberal Christian ideas that Genesis is symbolical, that man's awareness is the cause of the tragic meaninglessness in the world today, and that the only escape is for man to realize that he can cooperate with the enterprise of creation, for participation in this enterprise makes mortal man part of God's eternal design. And he says, the most gallant and by far the most nearly successful attempt to do this, cooperate with God's eternal design, has been that of Teilhard de Chardin,